Let's see if I can send this to the stream and see what happens. Well, this is going to make me annoyed if we're not. Do it. All right, you guys just keep coming back. If it refreshes, I'm going to go back out to events and see if something didn't save, and I'm not sure what's going on.
Hey, Mike Black, it says on air.
It says it on this, but it doesn't show it on LinkedIn.
Okay.
So we're on Vimeo where I have zero audience, and like we might as well just talk to each other at that point.
I see it on LinkedIn now. It's up.
Is it?
Yep.
Oh, there it is. We are live. Okay, very good. All right, welcome everybody. Some technical issues. I apologize. My name is Mike Black. We will get this started. I'm going to cut this. Face. And today we are talking about revenue enablement. And and I'm going to say my comment on this is that we were just having this debate around how do you start? Where does this all come in? What is revenue enablement today? And my question, or the way I want to start this with, is this: first, revenue or sales is the lifeblood or oxygen of any business. If you don't have enough, you're done. Doesn't matter if you're Amazon or if you're Page Black. At some point, if you don't have revenue coming in the door, you will go out of business. It's just Amazon has a little bit of longer time to wait before that happens. Second, revenue enablement is the process by which you most efficiently acquire and maintain customers. And so that looks at, as a part of this, key parts of this are alignment, process, customer experience, and also I would just say sales experience as well. Now, there are a lot of challenges in the marketplace right now, especially in sales as we're thinking about it. SBI Growth reported that virtually all salespeople are looking for new positions. Even happy ones are checking out where they can go. And when we're looking at marketing, because that's kind of my area, so I was digging into that a little bit, 35% of marketing decision makers reported that improving marketing alignment, bringing in that alignment piece in again, is key for their success in 2022. Now, one of my guests, James Franklin, is going to have going to discuss this from a CRO perspective. And Jim is a proven sales leader with, let me bring Jim on the screen here. I apologize. There we go. I'm not used to this new interface we're trying out, folks. Jim is a proven sales leader with more than 25 years of success building and leading B2B sales teams, selling software, SaaS, professional services. He often serves as either a fractional CRO or CSO, and he provides advisory or implementation services for B2B companies, resulting in predictable, repeatable, scalable, and profitable revenue. And who doesn't want all of those? All right, so next week, Jim's going to be my guest, and we're going to dig into the CRO role. We're going to dig in deeper on his perspective on revenue enablement. But my next guest is Mike Bowers, and he's a customer experience solutions sales executive. That's a heck of a typo on there on LinkedIn, Mike, at M Corp and Client Experience. So Mike's a curious and strategic customer-centric sales leader. He has a habit of seeing big problems and then fixing them. I have big problems, Mike. You have to come talk to me. His mission is to lead with empathy, understanding, and have a tireless drive to help everyone he meets. He's a CX or client experience evangelist, is my experience when I watch his LinkedIn profile. So if you're interested in client experience, go connect with Mike. He will be my guest on the 24th, and we're going to dig into client experience and his perspective. And I'll tell you that it has involved employee experience, which I'm a firm believer in. Finally, we have Keziah. I'm going to say the German version, von Stollen. I apologize, Keziah. Founder and CEO at Vannon, Chief of Staff. And if you don't know what a Chief of Staff is, she will be my guest on February 17th, and we're going to talk about that. However, she has 14 years of management consulting experience at Accenture. She ran their sales transformation at high-tech companies. And then she also spent 5 years in their sales operations, and she was also as Chief of Staff. And I just blew that, Keziah, so you can correct me where I got that wrong. So, yeah, well, it's close. Hopefully it's close enough.
Yeah.
All right. So, Jim, I'm going to start with you because I think, actually, let me tell you, audience, that I brought them in because of their different perspectives that, a chief of staff is going to be looking a lot at alignment. Obviously, Mike's is passionate about customer experience. Jim has his overall view. And in fact, this all started with Jim because Jim mailed me and said, hey, Mike, I think your audience needs to know more about revenue enablement. And I looked at it and I was like, what's this revenue enablement thing? Because there's so many terms. And I said, he's right. And I really agree with some of his perspectives, although I'm going to try and debate him on some of them. So we'll see how that goes.
Welcome that debate, Mike.
I know you do. I'm a little intimidated, Jim. But Jim, why don't you get us started? The audience for our podcast is a middle market company, business leaders who are trying to go from that middle market. Maybe they have 15 million in revenue and they want to be 30, or they're 125 and they want to be that 250. They vary in employee size from say 50 to 500. Why is this important to them? Why, first, actually tell us what your perspective on what revenue enablement is and why it's important for those companies.
Sure. I think that, revenue enablement, it really is the holistic approach to combining and aligning sales, marketing, and customer success. And you mentioned in the introduction, the outcome or output is going to be a predictable, scalable, repeatable, and profitable revenue stream, right? And that really is the underlying factor and the driver for all of this. So if we look at it, and how do you get started, right? So we were debating this as a team earlier, and this is really not a self-promotion, but I think the critical component is the CRO, and why is that? The CRO, in my experience, and there are active discussions around this as well, but for a middle market, having that CRO, that's the one owner of the revenue streams, which are sales, marketing, and customer experience, and aligning the customers, the buyer's journey to those discrete components, and then the outcome is going to be driving that successful revenue and having the ability to create the process and metrics around that. So I think that, we could go on for hours, but there are other people that I want to chime in on this call. So I think that again, having, that executive owner of those three pieces, and then having people underneath that chief revenue officer.
All right. So audience, if you're a marketer, Jim said he should be your boss, and I will debate that later. No, we'll pick on him a little bit later. So you've worked at large firms.
It's a team, Mike. It's a team.
It totally is a team. I'm kidding. It's a team. And honestly, I agree with your perspective that the idea of it's the entire customer journey, and how you own that and build that depends a little bit on the company type, all of those things. But I'm a fan of everything you're saying. Because what's your perspective having done this at large companies?
Now we've done it at large companies and also, scaling companies. I think what's important about this, and I like the concept of revenue enablement because it's describing how are we designing this around the customer experience. So it doesn't really matter if you're a startup or $1 billion business. That is, you're running a business and that the customer is at the center, and they should be. So what this is taking, like Jim said, it's marketing, sales, customer service, and then kind of going down to the next level and going, how are we enabling the buyer? And then how are we enabling our internal people on that journey? And when we talk about getting started with it, the way that we've kind of gone and done it is designing that buyer journey. And like I was saying earlier to you guys, it's either for big companies with very complicated processes, it's an offsite, it's 2 or 3 days with all the process teams in there designing what this looks like, what it currently looks like, what the ideal state is, understanding the gaps. But then when you go to kind of some of these more scaling companies, the other day we did this on a Miro board. It was a free download, and we just wrote out the customer journey. And then from there, you go internally and you start to design the processes that support that customer journey across those 3 functions. And then you go on to, okay, so who's going to own those, the roles and responsibilities, and starting to say, how do we actually enable those people, which goes back to what revenue enablement is. It's like, what is the training they have to take? What assets do we need to give them for them to be able to do this effectively and support that journey? So you go on and on about the details of actually how to implement this, but I think solving for the customer experience is what really is the most important.
So let me, having done this, one of the questions that let me just ask this question directly, is how important is some of the customer data in making those decisions? So the reason I ask is we do some market research, and we go ask questions like, what's this, how do you make these decisions? Who do you turn to when you're making these decisions? Do you Google this term? Do you turn to your network? How is that happening? And then we use that to help build out the customer journey. And, it's aspirational to be able to do that, but it's also not often always practical to do that. For some companies that are trying to scale, they don't have the time to take 3 months to do that project.
Mhm.
What's your perspective on that? How much do you like to pull in? I think larger companies do a better job of that, but larger companies often fall down on that, I think.
But I think you can do that even not taking 3 days. You could do a kind of a scrappy view of pain points that your customers face and solve for those first. Take everything, go, what's the what is the critical piece of this journey that we need to get right? And what are the current pain points that we need to solve for, or focus on those first?
I mean, some of that is easy if you go up a level that says, okay, who is my target market, right? What is my ideal customer profile? Who are my buyer personas? And then from there, the business challenges they face tend to fall out pretty fast, quite frankly. At least I've seen that based on my experience, right? So you don't
totally
have to
fair.
spend so, I mean, but those components of, what's your target market, what's your ideal customer profile, and then who are your buyer personas. Otherwise, how are you going to get your messaging right?
Right. Well, and so that we look at messaging from a research perspective, but we don't insist on it, if that makes sense. So I get it. Yeah, that's a great conversation. All right, Mike Bowers, what's your perspective?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm going to take little pieces from both James and Kesey. I mean, I think that ultimately CX is from my perspective and my experience on front lines. Really, that's the point of the spear. I think James used the word holistic. We like to look at a holistic approach. How customers are getting into a business. A lot of these mid-market companies might arguably make it more difficult for their customers to get access into their company. So really looking at people, process, technology, how companies are listening or getting feedback across all their channels, across all their touch points, be it customer service or customer success, be it sales enablement, or partner or organizations, which are often an afterthought, and then the data that all of that gives us. We like to think of customer experience as being this holistic journey. I would say, and I'll be a little bit the antagonist. Sometimes CX gets rolled up underneath marketing, and sometimes can take a back seat. And I would prefer to see it at a CRO level, or certainly reporting into the C-suite. Many companies have a CXO today. So, again, I'm kind of taking pieces from both. I think it all starts with the customer journey, and the gaps. As Kezia mentioned, it's the gaps analysis, understanding where companies are making it hard for their customers to do business.
So, Mike, you or before the call when we were just chatting, one of the things you talked about was the employee experience, and I think that's critical today. We've got the Great Resignation,
Right.
and I mentioned that stat earlier intentionally of the idea that your sales team, everybody on your B2B sales leaders, everybody on your sales team is looking for a job. Even if they love working for you, there may be opportunities out there, and they're having calls. That's the research at this company. They interviewed 250 salespeople late last year. All of them were open to looking. Or open for opportunity. They were actually actively seeking opportunities. So therefore,
more so in the SaaS space, I would say in the SaaS space, I think turnover is north of 70%.
Yeah. So Mike, talk a little bit about the customer experience from the employee experience perspective, because I think in this massive shift that we're in, that's critical.
Yeah, I mean, I think with my little point of view here, I think if listeners took one thing away to kind of focus on that they could enact immediately, it's the whole onboarding process. It's how does the recruiting process, what does that look like from a new employee perspective prior to even joining the company? What does that process look like? Because you're telling your new employees what the experience is like solely based on that. And this is all tied to metrics, right? The faster and better someone is onboarded, the more they feel appreciated and listened to, and all those things I think are really critical to getting to that point, that time to tenure point that James is looking for from a revenue production perspective. I think the other piece of it, and I'm gonna be real controversial here for everybody and say comp is absolutely it's the elephant in the room. Companies don't want to address it, particularly on the sales side, but salespeople need to be compensated properly.
I would say everybody needs to be compensated properly. No, I mean, I don't, that's not tongue in cheek, right? So, I mean, because I spend a lot of time on comp plans, but, part of the whole revenue enablement and part of the compensation, and especially from a CRO perspective, is that I tie all three of those areas, their bonus compensation, marketing bonus compensation, CX bonus compensation, to our overall revenue goals. That helps. That really helps drive alignment, and it really does work, right? Because it's funny because in some of these active conversations I've had with CMOs, they're like, "Oh, sales doesn't," we give them great leads and they don't follow up, and sales is like, "You give us bunk leads and blah blah blah," right? And then how many times have you heard the CMO being fired for not hitting their number, right? Not very often. And so to your point, Mike Bauer, is that the compensations, when you do that, you need to look, in my opinion, in my position, is the bonuses are all across all three areas. Your bonuses are in the compensation plan. Obviously, the salespeople would have a much higher variable typically, right? But that is you got to compensation plans drive behavior. Let's face it.
Yep.
Totally. I think too, also to your point, Mike Bowers, about onboarding people with that mentality that everyone should be a seller in some capacity. I mean, if you have 25 to 50 people in a company, everyone, I don't care if you're an engineer or the frontline salespeople, you have to have that sales mentality in some way. And maybe their general competencies is not to be a seller. So that's where the enablement comes in to say, we know that these customer service reps are responsible for almost 100% of our renewal sales. How do we enable them to be able to have the conversations, loop in the front, whatever the structure is, everyone has to have that competency. So it starts with the interview. It starts with to get very tactical, putting something in your interview process around testing for sales competencies.
Yeah.
And that's how it will kind of drip throughout the organization.
Good point. Yeah.
That is fascinating.
Yep.
And I think that's absolutely true.
It's very tactical for everyone. How do we actually do this?
That's right.
Right. Well, we're going there in just a minute. Oh no, we're going there. I'm looking at the time. We're going there now. So my one comment on this is listening to this conversation, and you can see it in companies in the turf wars. Jim, brought it up with the idea that, how often are CMOs fired when they don't hit numbers versus salespeople who do get fired for not hitting numbers. And the turf that comes with that Mike's like, well, hey, there needs to be a CXO and we need to start with the CRO. And there's this turfiness, and that is a huge problem. And one of the things I really like about the idea of revenue enablement is that everybody has the same focus, and everybody having the same focus. And if it's a CRO, honestly, if it's a CXO that's leading the effort, obviously CRO is going to be good because of that. I'm not saying that it's like customer experience is the only piece of that. What I'm saying is having one executive that is leading that effort and getting everybody in alignment. That's probably more critical than even having it be a CRO. Although I will say that I think a CRO is a great move for that too. So to that. So that said, let's get started. Because you started us on this. Why don't you give us your thoughts about like what are your initial steps? If I'm a middle market CEO and I'm like, man, this revenue enablement stuff is awesome. I need to have alignment's a huge problem in our company. We're not hitting our numbers. Marketing and sales are constantly having fights. What are my best steps to get started with this from your perspective?
Well, and I think James can talk a little bit more about the talent model that's recommended with who's in charge and who sits across if it's a CRO, then you have the directors of marketing, sales, and service. But so I'll let him talk about that a bit more. But when we start to get down into that, okay, you're the CRO now, you own it. Setting up the charter. I mean, it's a typical kind of organization. You set up your charter. What are you going to do? What's the objective? How are you going to measure it? Who's responsible for what? Setting that up. And and defining that. And then it's going back to that designing of the customer journey. What do you want that to look like? Taking in the feedback that you have from customers, NPS scores, pain points, bringing that into it and redesigning it the way that you want and what is ideal. And then I think, I mentioned earlier, then you go into your as is, your to be, what's the goal, what's the delta. And then I think what really is important to me is the change management of anything that you're going to roll out to this entire enablement group. How do you define what the process is going, how the process is going to change? How are you going to train them on it? How are you going to make sure that all of these new enablement processes that you've designed are actually adopted? So to me, that kind of establishing what's going to change, how to make sure it's adopted is also going to be really important. And then setting up a system to measure it.
So that's going to dip right into culture.
Mm-hmm.
Are we a culture that adapts, is comfortable with change, or are we not? And I think that's a really big challenge in today's world. For, if you're not comfortable with change as a person,
People are not typically, but that you're right. That is a huge component of it. That's where I see one of the biggest challenges is how in fact do you manage that component, because people don't like to change. But if it's it's about communication, and I think Mike Bowers might have mentioned this, is what are the metrics, and how do we tie in the employee experience to that too, right? How do getting everybody to march in the same direction when those three areas are like herding cats, right? So that's the lead, manage, and accountability, right? And so correctly defining roles, responsibility, and then setting the accountability, and then measuring to that, right?
Yep.
I think it all helps to have everyone under the CRO though, because then the handoffs aren't so siloed. Because right now that's something that a lot of our clients struggle with still. It's the handoff between those siloed organizations when you have a leader at the top of each of them.
Yep. Right. All right. Keziah jumps in on James's side. I'm losing this debate. I'm kidding. I'm not really debating it. Mike, we've talked about employee experience, customer experience. How, give us your perspective on getting started and how that would feed into the revenue enablement.
Yeah. I mean, I think understanding it from the employee's point of view is pretty key. I mean, they're frontline. They're understanding what customers are going through. I think from a change management perspective, it's helping the organization really understand what's in it for them, both personally and professionally, and for the business, and then ultimately getting them. I would say skeptics, getting those skeptics on board with the mission. Again, to me, that all ties back to this issue of culture and alignment. And, to me, those are the most important pieces.
All right. Yeah. I believe that your skeptics that's your biggest problem with that, like this new shift.
Well, and
it's going to be a challenge.
It's turning
measure success, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's turning skeptics into advocates. Skeptics, I think, are good to any debate. It's leveraging, because they're the ones that are gonna tell their buddies to not get on board.
Well, I mean,
right.
for example, we talked about the gap analysis and setting a baseline, right? But if you had some specific examples, right? Deal velocity, win rates, LTVs, right? You can show incremental success there, right? It doesn't take long to say, okay, by doing this, we've increased our win rates. Even if you can increase your win rates by 10%, that adds a monstrous number to the bottom line, right? And we also talked about this before we started, is let's do land and expand. You see a lot of that in these scale up companies. So, but that's an important piece. I want to land and expand. I don't want to land and lose. Right. So.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Mike's point around getting your skeptics on board, I would just say view your skeptics as an opportunity to understand the challenges you face, because they're going to be telling you things that are hard. They don't believe it, which means that you haven't convinced them that this is actually a real plan. So maybe Jim's idea, I keep doing that because I look at your name.
No worries, sorry.
Jim's idea of let's measure it. Well, now we have data to throw at them and say, hey, look, this is how we're being successful as we've done this and that we've improved. And we can have this opportunity to try and convince them. And I think also change. I mean, the fundamental reason people don't like change is they don't know how it's going to impact them. Does it mean they don't have a job next year? And do they have this, or does it mean that they will or won't have the support to transition into this new role? And unfortunately for some, it means that they will not have a job next year, and we're going to have to help them through that piece. But it also, the better you can support them, especially in this day and age where it almost is the age of the customer and the age of the employee, that's critical. So Jim, I left it with you. What are I wanted you to kind of, since this was your idea, I wanted to give you the last word on how we get started.
Oh, well, I mean,
other than what are some of the basic steps?
I thought we did talk about that quite, but I mean, the bottom line is that, at the CEO, CFO level, right? You have to say, there is an issue here, right? I'm not hitting my revenue numbers, to your point, or, at the very beginning, Mike. It's the lifeblood. Sales and marketing, and all three of those areas really are critical. But again, if you're not hitting your bottom line numbers, that's you got to admit, okay, what am I going to do? So to your point, where do I start, right? So I think it's like, let's face it, revenue enablement is going to create this framework, right? It is going to create this framework for repeatable, scalable, predictable, and profitable revenue. But it has to have all three of those, the components that we've been talking about. So how do we get started? First of all, you got to admit that there's an issue, right? And then to Keziah's point is like, okay, if we have this issue, how are we going to create the framework? I mean, have we got our buyer's journey defined? A lot of times I don't see it. Have you got your sales process defined? A lot of times I don't see it. If you got, your account expansion and your retention and your voice of the customer defined. So, I mean, it's pretty easy to come up with that gap analysis, right? So you say, okay, I realize I do have the problem, right? I realize I'm going to have to invest in this. And then, I typically like to say, let's do a 4 or 5 hour meeting and just whiteboard all this stuff and, identify, how we roll out a revenue enablement plan and what seats you need to get started with that.
All right. Very good. Well, I closed with you for a reason, sir. Thank you. That was really good. Nice summary of it. All right. So that is it for today. Everybody, we will hope you have a great